Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. And this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. At this year's Oscars, the critically acclaimed sci-fi epic Dune won a total of 6 awards, cementing its status as a major pop cultural event. Set in the far future, the film, like the 1965 book it is based on, draws obvious inspiration from Arab and Middle Eastern influences. Most of the story takes place on the fictional desert planet of Arrakis and follows the messianic journey of Paul Atreides, a young outsider who ultimately comes to lead the indigenous Fremen in a conflict against the imperial overlords plundering their planet's precious resources. But the epic's relationship to Islam in the Middle East is both complicated and controversial. With the release of the film last year, these aspects came under close scrutiny by reviewers. These conversations have become a microcosm of a larger discourse about Orientalism, colonialism, and representation in fiction, and particularly in science fiction. My guest today is Haris Durrani, an author and historian at the University of Princeton, whose many essays examining these aspects of Dune have been published in the Washington Post, the LA Review of Books, The Nation, and of course, here at New Lines. Haris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I think it's fair to say that you've become one of the most prominent Dune scholars over the last year or so. My first question, I suppose, is simply why Dune? It's clear that it means a lot to you personally, but what is it about this story in particular that has inspired such intense interrogation?
Why Dune is such a huge question, and I will try to answer it briefly.
Okay.
I think the way I initially came to Dune was as a kid. My dad is from Pakistan, my mom is from Dominican Republic. I grew up in a post 9/11 America, and I'm Muslim, and so reading Dune was just a beautiful way. I mean, of course, we'll talk about the many problems with the novels, but as a kid reading Dune, it was just an amazing thing to see a fully realized science fiction future in which Islam was taken seriously. Over the last year or so, the reason why Dune has been more than I've seen a lot of discourse, both positive and negative, about the novel and the film. And I felt that my experiences with the novels were not reflected in anything that I read or heard. My experience is not, the Muslim experience or anything like that, but it's at least one experience that I didn't see reflected anywhere else. So most of my writing is just me asserting my sheer existence.
And what is your experience of the novel? And
Yeah.
or perhaps you should start with what you feel the overarching reviewers were saying, and then
Yeah.
your own take on it.
Yeah, I think that there's a tendency to uh, cast off the novels as this Orientalist white savior narrative, which it has elements of all of those things, and it definitely is Orientalist. But I think there's and even among people who um, are more positive about the novels will often tend to say that, well, the novels deal with Islam and with Arab culture and Islamic history, but these are merely cosmetics, and these are just exotic aesthetics that
Right.
it creates this far future, this sense of strangeness. Whereas for me, reading the novels was like speaking with my with a weird, slightly conservative uncle at the mosque telling me this weird science fiction story. You know what I mean? It was a more internalist view from within Islam, even though Herbert himself is not Muslim. And I think that was something that was a very strange experience, reading this old white dude telling this
Yeah.
very Islamic story. And that was something that I hadn't, even the depth of the metaphors and the speculation and the way that he draws on Islamic themes is something that I think, if one isn't in Islamic studies or isn't Muslim, is actually hard to pick up, because some of it is so subliminal. It's not just the language and the use of Arabic terms, but the storytelling and the ideas.
Well, a lot of the interrogation, as you say, has focused on this notion of the white savior, the person who swoops in and rescues the natives from themselves. And I think even a summary reading of the story of Dune, you can see why people would think that. They would think that about Paul Atreides, because he does come across as this Lawrence of Arabia figure. There are these uncomfortable colonial overtones, even in the movie, frankly. And I wonder why you think it's more complicated than it appears on the page.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question. I think for me, I tend to lean against the idea. I tend to say that Dune is Orientalist, but it's not a white savior narrative, because even in the first novel, I think there's a tendency in these golden age science fiction novels to say, well, they're all about some white boy, gaining his adulthood, his manhood, and saving the day. And so people tend to ascribe that onto Dune. But if you read the novel carefully, it's very clear that Herbert does not he sympathizes with Paul, and there's a sense in which the novels are sympathetic toward his character. But it's also very clear that Paul is not really the savior of the Fremen, and the Fremen may not even need Paul to save them. And that's something that people say is in the later books as well, but it is very clear in the first novel. And even Frank Herbert himself read critiques of T.E. Lawrence's Seven Pillars. For example, Suleiman Musa's T.E. Lawrence, An Arab View, arguing that for Arab agency and against the idea of T.E. Lawrence as this critical figure in history. And so it's very clear that Herbert was engaging with these critical histories as well as the hagiographies of T.E. Lawrence and playing on those in very complicated ways. And I would say even the film, I think, again, because in Hollywood we tend to look for these narratives of, the white boy saves the day, that it seems like that on the surface, but so much of the way that Paul's character is portrayed in the film, I think, is actually even more negative even than in the books. But I still have other problems with the film beyond. I think the problems with the film are elsewhere, and with the novels are elsewhere.
Okay, well, we'll come to the problems with the film and the novel, but I just want to understand, do you think that the misreading of it as a white savior narrative, do you think the misreading of that is because we are looking at it through Western eyes? And if you look at it through what you might call Muslim eyes, or you look at it as a Muslim story, it changes the way you interpret Dune?
I think definitely. I think part of it does have to do with which lens you come to the story with. And I think
Well,
also,
no, just explain that bit, Harris, because the book is the book. I mean, the book there weren't multiple editions of it. It is the book. So how can you come at it from a different perspective and see something so different in it from a Muslim perspective, for example?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is if you read the references to Islam in the novel. I mean, I think part of it is that there's a tendency to say, oh, Dune is, Arabs in the future. Basically, it's Arabs on a desert planet on Tatooine or something. When what's always been so attractive about Dune is that it's many things at once, right? So it is about Islam, but it's also about the Quileute tribe in the United States. It's also about decolonization. It's about Ismaili history. It's about oil politics. It's about all of these things. And so when you're looking at Paul's character, his character is both an analogy for example, Jesus or the Prophet Muhammad, but he's also an analogy for the colonial leaders. But he's also very clearly, explicitly, he's the Mahdi, right? And so what's my interpretation of the novels, and I think this is clear even if you listen to Frank Herbert's interviews as well, but you don't need those interviews, is that Herbert is trying to speculate what would the coming of a future Mahdi look like in the far future, and what would be the dangers of someone calling themselves Mahdi or people calling him Mahdi when maybe he's not actually the savior that you want him to be.
And do you think that comes across on a cursory reading of the novel or a watching of the film?
I think it does come across in a reading in both, but again, it can be seen as subtle because part of what Herbert is trying to do, at least in the novel, is he says, I want to show you the superhero narrative and your complicity within it. And so a lot of it is, I think that's part of the reason it's difficult to read the book is he's both, mirroring the superhero narrative and the savior narrative at the same time as he's trying to critique it. And I think in some of those ways, he ends up reinscribing the narrative. But I think at the same time, you can't just call it a straight up white savior narrative. He is at least trying to do something complicated with it. And I think the movie has a similar issue. But yeah.
I mean, the Muslimness of Dune is something that is quite stark, not merely, as you say, Paul is referred to as the Mahdi, the Fremen faith. One of the faiths is called Zen Sunniism,
right.
Other things like the teachings of the Hadith and so on and so on. How much substance do you think there is to that Muslimness? Because it's one thing to reference these things as a kind of window dressing. It's another thing if Herbert was actually trying to engage with these Islamic ideas. And I wonder, you certainly seem to think that he was trying to. I wonder if perhaps he wasn't really trying to engage. This is 1965. If he
Right.
wasn't really trying to engage with these Islamic ideas, but it does feel to me the kind of, like, in the same way that Shakespeare used references to Italy.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
wasn't really writing about Italy. He was just trying to suggest somewhere far off and exotic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So I have an article at Tor.com, which is basically a very detailed critique of this exact idea, because I really think that's not an accurate reading of the novels. Because if you, for example, I know it's Ramadan. I don't know when this is airing, but right now it's Ramadan. And I think one of the coolest things in Dune is he actually because on Dune, Arrakis has two moons. So he speculates in the novels on how you would calculate the Ramadan on a lunar calendar when you have two moons. And he has other aspects that, to me, the use of the Islamic stuff isn't just metaphorical, but it's speculative. That stuff about the Mahdi. He's not saying, "Oh, Paul is like the Mahdi." He's saying, "What if Paul is the Mahdi, or claiming to be the Mahdi?" So he's asking these speculative questions about what Islam and Arab culture and many other religions and cultures would look like thousands and thousands of years into the future. So, for example, in the book, the Fremen say that Paul is like Abu Zayd, who traveled in a frigate, escaping the guild to one end of the galaxy and then came back. And that is very Abu Zayd. So what is Abu Zayd? Abu Zayd, it means father of Zayd, right? And one of the Prophet Muhammad's son was Zayd. And the story of the frigate is very clearly the story of Isra al-Miraj. So Frank Herbert there, he's not just taking language, but he's actually taking like one of the most essential stories in Islam and imagining how a future version of Muslims would sort of reinterpret and reimagine that story in their own language of the future, which to me, that's something way beyond just aesthetics. He's actually thinking and speculating about how religion will change and evolve and be reinterpreted in new ways in the distant future. To me, that's why I've always loved Dune, is it has that speculative element about Islam.
Perhaps the most unusual part is the book's exploration of jihad, which is taken out of the film. But even if you take into account that Dune was written, half a century before the War on Terror, it's still quite striking to see jihad used in that way, in a way that isn't really negative. And Herbert seems to engage with the concept of jihad beyond the popular conception of it as a synonym for holy war. He has this thing where Paul talks about teaching his followers that each man is a little war. And you've written that you think that's a reference to the idea of jihad and nafs, like the inner struggle.
Yes. Yeah. So much. I think what's so funny about Dune is we tend to think of Dune, we think giant sandworms and spaceships and spice. But, the action scenes are very short. And most of Dune is just, people thinking to themselves. And I think in that sense, Herbert was very interested in jihad al-nafs. I don't know if he explicitly was thinking of that himself, but even in his use of jihad and the material outer jihad of warfare, I think even that is exceptional, because there's different ways of reading jihad in the novels. One way is, jihad is this evil thing, the way we think, the way some people think of it today, post 9/11. And then there's the way in which jihad has a sort of decolonial connotation, at least in the first novel. But what I think even an even closer reading of the book that's so fascinating is that the way that jihad comes to the Fremen as this war and violence is through the missionary activities that influence the Fremen to produce this jihad in the first place. So what we associate today as this sort of the bad, evil Muslim terrorist, Herbert is sort of reappropriating and saying that this kind of violence actually comes from what's basically a sort of Jesuit Christian missionary force influencing and modifying Fremen traditions.
He was writing in the midst of the global decolonial struggle, so it's quite likely that he was thinking about it in that context, jihad obviously being used as a way of motivating people against colonialism.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's talk about the adaptation into the recent film. This is something that you and others have been critical of, because we are still in the post 9/11 cultural space, and so one of the major changes, of course, is that they took out references to jihad and changed it to crusade or to holy war. And you've been critical of the adaptation in general for failing to engage with the kind of Islamicness of the book. Tell me, you said earlier that you had some issues with the film. Let's start there.
Sure. Yeah, my issue with the film is I mean, beyond the casting issue, which everyone has sort of bludgeoned to death by this point, but is more about.
Well, let's start with the casting issues. I
Okay,
mean,
yeah,
perhaps the
sure.
audience isn't familiar with it.
Sure, yes. So there are basically no people from the Middle East or North Africa cast in the film, and there are no Muslims in the film, with the exception of I believe his name is David Dalmatian, who is Iranian, who plays the Mentat to the Baron. But he's not playing a Fremen. But I mean, so I mean, it's very weird that, of course, Dune is drawing on a lot. It's not really. I always like to say, I'm coming to it from a Muslim perspective, but it's not just about Muslims. It's also about Native Americans and indigenous tribes in Brazil. It has so many influences.
Right, Haris, they didn't cast Native Americans. They didn't cast. You know what I mean? Like,
none of that.
I understand that there are arguments against it, but frankly,
Yeah, but to me, what's disturbing is it sort of casts this binary of, for the most part, the imperialists are all white people, and then the Fremen are all sort of generic people of color, with the exception of Stilgar, who they cast a Spanish actor, right? And so it's very frustrating that a book which is in large part influenced by MENA and Islamic culture and religion, even beyond Islam. There's a lot of references in the book to Christian Arab history. None of that is reflected in the casting choices. But my problems with the movie were deeper than that, which is that the film uses its Arabic and Islamic terms as sort of set dressing, in the same way that the makers of the film said that the books do that, which I don't think is true, but I think the film does that. It does treat the Arab and Islamic influences as set dressing, right, where they're not often explained. The deeper meaning is not there, and then even the way that the imagery and the visuals and the aesthetic, the audiovisual aesthetics, the Fremen and Arrakis is very, vaguely ethnic. Literally, Hans Zimmer, who did the music, he literally said Arrakis is very ethnic, so we have to use wooden instruments.
Yeah.
And it's like my Lion King soundtrack, which was African. Yeah. Right. And then whereas the Empire,
it's kind of shocking. We toss this argument to one side, but it's really kind of astonishing. Really shocking. I mean, you're talking about huge global cultures. You're not talking about some minor culture somewhere.
Right. And for me, what I love so much about Dune is that it isn't a generic take on. It is mixing a lot of different cultures and religions, but it's definitely not generic. His references are extremely, extremely specific. He's referring to Isra al-Miraj as right, and making the Burak a space frigate. Right. Whereas, I don't expect the film to, do a full appendix on the religion of Dune or anything like that. But I think what's great about film is it's an audiovisual medium, unlike a novel. So even though you can't describe everything, you can try to bring in those influences into the visuals and the sound of the film, and they don't do that really. And
and I think, this is my critique of it as well. This is why I was sort of interested to hear your perspective on it, because my criticism of the movie and in general with the Hollywood's depiction of Islamic culture is the lack of effort that goes into it. And actually, I'll give you an example, which is from another movie by Denis Villeneuve, who directs this one, which is called Arrival, which I think is not a hugely popular movie, but it was about, I don't know if you had a chance to see it.
Yes.
It's about humans trying to communicate with aliens and learning their language. And that movie goes to great lengths to depict this alien but internally coherent language. And in the movie itself, there's a brief moment of Arabic in the movie, and it's total gibberish. It's just, it's not written. It's not real words that are written. The letters don't connect. It's total rubbish. And I thought, isn't it what better example can you think of Hollywood laziness than spending millions on an alien language and not taking the 10 seconds to correctly depict, one of the half dozen major languages of our species.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. And to me, it's especially frustrating because Denis Villeneuve really is. I mean, I actually like the Dune film. I don't think it's an amazing film, but I enjoyed it. I just had problems with it. But Denis Villeneuve is one of my favorite directors, and especially one of his first films, Incendie. I think it has some issues, but is a really fascinating take on it's basically a metaphor for the diaspora and the Lebanese civil war, and it deals with these questions of violence and history and the problem of a narrative that you can't quite trust in the Middle East. And that is what Dune is. I mean, Frank Herbert, he was trying to deal with his own role as a white man writing about these other cultures. And much of the book is sort of him struggling through that in good ways and bad ways. And whereas I think the film just tries to say, okay, it doesn't deal with the specificity and the subversive quality of white people trying to tell the story about brown people.
Well, you told NPR that you didn't think that Villeneuve had put in the work. So what would putting in the work look like?
I think putting in the work would have been, doing the research and, both. I don't mean that Denis Villeneuve shouldn't have directed the film. I mean, it would have been great to get another director with a certain background. But I mean, as long as, he had writers or consultants who were working on the script with him who are of Arab or Muslim background, which are not necessarily the same thing, of course, or, even in the set design, the dresses and the architecture and the music, if he brought in Muslim and Arab artists, there's so much amazing, cool Muslim and Arab artwork out there and artists who are brilliant, who could have done some futuristic take on the hijab or something. I don't know, right?
Isn't it such a missed opportunity, don't you think?
Yeah, it really is. It's very sad. It's very sad.
It honestly, I think the only word for it is sad. It's just because Hollywood has some of the greatest artists of the American experience now, and yet you feel like, wouldn't it be wonderful to have them work on these ideas, these Islamic ideas, Arab ideas, and yet you don't see it at all. I just think it's such a shame that we're living through this particular period when one of the world's great cultures is so denigrated by another one of the great cultures. This is actually the same thing with casting. I mean, we'll go back to it. I was talking to our producer about this because we were talking about the star of the movie, Timothée Chalamet, and he was saying, it's a shame they didn't get like an Arab actor to do it. And in a way, I can come with Hollywood a little bit, because they say, you have to have the actor has to be of a certain generation, and maybe there aren't that many major Arab actors of that generation. Maybe Rami Malek would be the only one. So, okay, you have to have a major star. I'll come with you. And then Zendaya, okay, she's a woman of color, very famous star. Okay, I'll come with you. But then you get to, as you said, Javier Bardem, and it's like, I like Javier Bardem, he's a really good actor, but why can't you find a famous Arab actor? Like the Middle East is full of actors who are, really, really famous in Arab cinema. Wouldn't it have been amazing to put them into Dune?
Yeah, it's very sad. I really wish they had done that. And even for the rest of the empire and the other imperial characters, it sort of assumes this dichotomy of colonizer white man and colonized brown person, except for the leader of the colonized.
Yeah.
And it's actually it's interesting because I've seen other films with Javier Bardem, and he's much lighter skinned, and he seems a little bit darker in this.
Oh my god!
And actually, there's an interview on the Middle Geeks podcast where they mentioned that one of the interviewees mentions that their friend was on the set with Javier Bardem, and I think he was complaining that they were making his face too brown with the makeup.
Wow. Well, you see? Crazy.
So they know the issue, right? They know what the problem is.
Oh, this is absolutely. Well, this is why some of the pretense annoys me, because people know exactly what they are doing. Then they sort of pretend, oh no, we didn't realize. It's just the tinting of the movie.
Yeah, and they really don't. It's shocking that, I mean, Denis Villeneuve, call me. I'm still really willing to work for you to consult. But I think they really don't care. They just don't think about these things. They sort of understand, but they don't quite, because they've been casting for the second film. And one thing I've heard is, oh well, you don't really see any of the Emperor, the Padishah characters in the film, and the only ones you do see are black. So maybe the Padishah, the main emperor and his daughter, they're going to be cast as black actors. But they started casting those characters, and they're casting white actors. So, so I think they really don't care, and it's very frustrating.
You see, I guess my take on it isn't that they don't care; it's that they know exactly what they're doing, and that it's that there isn't sufficient pushback. I mean, the Arabic example from Arrival, I think, is a good example, because they wouldn't do that with any other language, because there would be a lot of pushback against it.
Right.
But when it comes to the Arabic language, because of the particular moment that we are living through, political moment, there isn't any pushback. And even when there is a pushback, it's kind of dismissed like, oh, whatever, it's just one moment in the movie. Why can't you focus on the bigger picture? Things like that.
Right. Yeah, they're not really thinking.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a bit about Dune as an allegory, because I think one of the reasons people get confused about it is because they are looking, and this I think is your point, that they're looking for, let's say, a simplistic interpretation of what is there. And in some ways, Dune allows for a myriad interpretations, because in some ways it's the retelling of the story of the Prophet Muhammad coming to the Arabs. It's an allegory for colonialism. It's something about the discovery of oil in the 20th century. There are these multiple references that you can look at and say, oh, that's what they're talking about. But in reality, it's a whole bunch of things. It isn't really a clear allegory.
Yeah, this is again why I love Dune so much, is it works on so many levels. It's multiple metaphors, but it's also speculating. And I think, Frank Herbert, I'll be honest, is not a great writer on a prose level. He has some great lines, but overall, he's not a great prose writer. But what for me elevates Dune to a work of art is how intertextual it is. In that it's very hard to pin down the politics and the message and what the metaphors are and what he's speculating about. But he's also so specific that it's not really vague. And I think as a result, if you're paying attention to the references and you're carefully reading the novels, it creates this almost destabilizing effect in the mind of the reader, of a careful reader. Which to me, they say that, good art has to destabilize you or disturb you at some level. And I think that's what Dune accomplishes at its best, is it all of the references are so interesting and confusing in good ways that it brings you to this level of, profound, deep destabilization, which I just love. It's brilliant and fun to explore that. But then the other thing I would just say is also with respect to the speculation. I mean, in some ways, Dune is a deeply, what some might say orthodox book with respect to Islam, because one reading of the speculative aspect of it is Frank Herbert is saying, well, maybe you shouldn't have a prophet in the future. Maybe, the Prophet Muhammad should be the last prophet, and he shouldn't try to claim prophecy afterwards, because then what results is just chaos. And so in that sense, the speculative elements are pretty orthodox.
It sounds like a direct criticism of the Shia view of the Mahdi, which is a whole other conversation.
Yeah, the whole thing is about that stuff. Yeah.
But I don't imagine that he was specifically criticizing the Shia faith.
No, he's also very sympathetic as well. He acknowledges that religion does have to continue, and you do have to have these leaders who take on the political and religious mantle. But he's also dealing with the difficulties of that. And I mean, the whole books are very much about a smiley history.
Yeah. You brought up Frank Herbert, so we should talk about the man. You've talked about his influences, but Dune is very much rooted in his worldview, I think.
Yes, it is. And his worldview is very complicated. I mean, to me, the biggest critique of Dune is that his conservative politics does come out. Perhaps even more so. His Orientalism is a sort of old school German Orientalism or something like that. I don't know. I don't think he was reading German Orientalists, but he's an old school Orientalist. But it really it's his politics that his parents, I believe, were in some kind of socialist commune, but then he became disillusioned with socialism, and he worked for a Republican senator. But then he befriended a Quileute man who actually partially raised him when he was a child. So he was very close with the Quileute tribe in Seattle, in Washington State. But then during his time in politics, his cousin, by the way, was Joe McCarthy, and he was working for his senator, and he saw his senator Robert Kennedy and Joe McCarthy all talking together as they were collaborating on the McCarthy trials. And he was absolutely disgusted by that. And that was sort of how he became disillusioned with politics. And so then for example, there's a very famous dinner scene in the book, which is not in the movie, which is pretty clearly him reimagining Kennedy, his senator, and Joe McCarthy, and sort of showing how the Harkonnens and the Atreides and everyone at the dinner table, all these aristocrats, are all sort of part of the same imperialist system. And so in many ways, the books are sort of his attempt to grapple with his varying political views. But you do see elements of his conservatism creep out, I think, not so much in the fact that he worked for a Republican senator, but more in his deeper beliefs about, for example, he struggles to acknowledge structural power. And for him, a lot of it is about the individual and how does the individual reconcile their relationship to society. And it makes it hard for him he kind of comes close, but he never really delivers a full-throated critique of the structures of capitalism or imperialism.
Even though in some way he was writing about colonialism.
Yes. But I think for him, it goes back and forth in the novels, which is why they're so difficult to read. My personal reading is that, yes, imperialism, there is this structure, but power structures only exist to the degree that you believe they exist. And so the way you break the chains is that you refuse to acknowledge that there is an inevitable power structure. And the Fremens, the reason that they're colonized, partly is because of the colonizer, but it is also because they can't recognize the chains of their oppression. So, which is, kind of true. And there's like kind of a Foucauldian analysis there, but also, power structures do exist in the world.
Today, that would be called blaming the victim.
Yes.
I wonder how you think how successful you think his treatment of colonialism is in the book. As you say, it's complicated. It isn't entirely obvious. I mean, I think you think that he isn't very sympathetic to the main protagonist, Paul Atreides, but it doesn't come across as like that in the novel, because the novel is about him.
Yeah, it's interesting because you are taught to like Paul along the way. But then there are certain moments in the novel where the way he treats his mother and the way his mother cowers before him as he starts gaining these spice visions. There's a very critical moment where he convinces the Fremen to change one of their key traditions in order for him to gain power. And you could read it as, oh, this is a white savior guy. He's claiming the power from the Fremen. But you could also read it as the same thing as like he's a white savior guy claiming the power from the Fremen, but as Frank Herbert meaning to say that this is actually a bad thing. And so in that sense, he is reinscribing the white savior narrative because the Fremen are following him. But on the other hand, the language and the way Herbert writes that scene is kind of negative. And Paul is trying to use the voice, which is a way to psychologically control people through language, to control the Fremen. And so it's a little bit uncomfortable when you read that scene. And it's very interesting to read scenes like that throughout the novel.
I wanted to talk about science fiction and colonialism more broadly, because Herbert may have had this complex relationship with it in the Dune novels, but actually colonialism and science fiction go hand in hand to some degree. It's one of those genres that's always been very concerned with discovery. It's a genre that was very popular in the colonial period, the age of exploration. And it's something I think that you've thought a lot about. Your academic work focuses a lot on the history of space exploration and how colonial norms are inscribed in contemporary Islamic law, international law.
Yes, yeah, Dune is very interesting because yes, science fiction has a sort of a large scope of dealing with colonialism. For me, what's especially interesting about Dune is that for Frank Herbert, colonialism is not just a metaphor; it's a real thing in the world that he's trying to grapple with. Whereas for a lot of science fiction, especially of his era, colonialism is very metaphorical, and it doesn't refer to specific things that are happening in the world today.
You also explored some of these topics in your own fiction.
Yes, yeah, my own fiction is probably subliminally influenced by Frank Herbert in a lot of ways, whether I know it or not. Because I all of my work is about my fiction and my historical academic work is about colonialism in some sense. And I think there's a tendency among critics, academic critics of science fiction and science fiction writers and readers these days to say you have to be fully creative in how you imagine the future, and then you have to imagine the future in the first place. And For me, what I love about good fiction is specificity, and I think there's an idea of creativity coming out of limits, and that if you write to your present or even to the past, a lot of my fiction, for example, is science fiction, but it takes place in the past, or it's about the
Right.
past continuing into the future, which
Right.
is a very Dunian, Frank Herbert, Pershian kind of thing. Because
Yeah.
what's so fascinating about Herbert is that, unlike his contemporaries, he wasn't imagining the future as this totally other place, but was imagining it as a very specific extension of the past. Um, and I think through limiting himself in how he imagined, he actually imagined something totally new and interesting. And
And
that's something I try to embody in my work.
yeah, and why do you think it's so important to have these limits in the writing?
Yeah. I think because partly, I like to say maybe it's the limits of my own creative mind. But I think also there's a tendency when one um, treats creativity as as coming from an abstract place, then it loses the grounding in the reality of human experience, but
Yeah.
also in the reality of our contemporary politics and
Yeah.
structures of power. And those limits are what allow you to write to and through and beyond the problems that we deal with today.
It's the politics aspect of it actually that makes it very interesting, because if you take out the possibility of these external answers, something that just appears deus ex machina into the novel, then what you have to do is you have to figure out the answers within the politics and the society, which is the more interesting thing. It's the thing that makes us human, I think.
Exactly. And then going to abstraction always, in my mind, lends you to just fall right into whatever preconceived biases or subjectivities you have in the first place. Whereas writing to politics and to your limits allows you the reflexivity to deal with your limits and try to move beyond them, which is what Herbert is trying to do in the Dune novel and what I try to do in my work as well, successfully or otherwise.
I thought we would start to close by talking about the reception of the film. And I know we talked a bit about the white savior narratives and how it was received, but in a way, there's been this interesting distinction in the way that it's been received by Muslim and Middle Eastern communities. Because on the one hand, there are people like yourself who clearly love the story and are thrilled that you've got this big sci-fi epic with these Islamic and Middle Eastern influences, even if they're critical of some of how those influences come across. But then there are others, I think, who just they can see nothing beyond the old tropes that they're so used to seeing with Western stories dealing with Middle Eastern context. And I wondered if you thought why these two diverging perspectives came about when it comes to the film.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've even seen some people, some Arab fans and stuff saying, "Oh, I really loved it. This is it's showing our culture. It's representing us in the future or something." And I'm just like, "Yeah, okay." But it's interesting that you have these divergent perspectives. I think part of it is the expectations that people come with when they see a big production Hollywood film, that they expect to see certain things that they
Yeah.
don't like. And I think in many ways those problematic aspects are present in the film, and so that's justified. But I think for people who love the source material, um, they are fascinated by the ways that Villeneuve is at least trying to adapt aspects of the story, even though he's not getting all of the cultural and religious nuances. Actually, I shouldn't say nuances, the core themes
The core themes,
of
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
book.
But can I
Yeah.
take from that that you tip more towards the not being able to get beyond the tropes aspect?
Yeah, I think for me, again, the issue with the film is not so much the white savior stuff, because I think, at least to me, the depiction of Paul's character is pretty negative. If you sort of realize that Denis Villeneuve is an indie filmmaker who's now being given these big budget films, and so his style is a very minimalist style. I mean, it's a very
Right.
big production, but in terms of how he tells story and indicates themes and character, it's by small moments and things that they don't tell you explicitly, which we're used to in a big production film, where they'll say, "Oh, this character feels this and thinks this."
Right.
Um, but my problem is more, the casting issues, the depiction of Islam and Arabs, and the the total, not total, but near total lack of agency given to the Fremen,
Yeah,
especially in
yeah.
that very last scene, to me was really, sort of, this black anger, and then he kills the guy. That to me was the most unsettling aspect of the film.
Yeah, I mean, these tropes, they never seem to go away.
Yeah,
I think Hollywood is very aware of them when it comes to certain communities, like the African American community. But when it comes to other communities, they just can't see beyond them, I think. Or it's
yeah,
just laziness, perhaps.
yeah. I think it's just part of, we just need writers and artists to be part of the process.
Yes, I think that's absolutely part of it. Speaking of writers, you've been a big advocate for Muslim and non-Western science fiction. You're one of the co-founders of the Muslim Protagonists annual conference at Columbia for Muslim writers. So I wanted to hear your perspective on where you think Arab and Islamic science fiction is at the moment. It is definitely having a little bit of a moment right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great work coming out on Arab science fiction, Muslim science fiction, both in the U.S. Among the diaspora, but also abroad, of course. I think it's been on the uptick. I mean, we're seeing, for example, Shannon Chakrabarty has a really wonderful trilogy of novels. There's a recent book out called the Golan's Book of South Asian Science Fiction. There's actually volume 2 of South Asian science fiction. There's just a lot of really great work out there. And I think for me, the reason I co-founded that Muslim Protagonist Symposium was, the content of stories are always important, but it can't just be about supporting individual books or stories or artists. There has to be structural change. And so whether it's successful or not, that was an attempt to say, it's not just about what you're reading, but it's about the platform and what books we give attention to. And I think the main thing is we need more writers and artists, but also the writers and artists are there, and we need the
Yeah,
readers
yeah,
to be
yeah.
paying attention and to be creating platforms to support them. So New Lines,
Mm.
is a great platform for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the plug. Very good. I suppose it's a bit of a provocative question, but do you think that Dune qualifies as Islamic science fiction?
The novel or the film, or
Let's say the
both?
novel.
Okay. Um, Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. There's the whole academic question of what is Islamic or Islamicate. I think I would qualify it as Islamic science because its core themes, its core concern, not its one of its many core concerns are explicitly questions about Islam and within the Islamic tradition.
So you would put it as
Yes.
one of the first, well, no, not one of the first, but one of the most important 20th century Islamic pieces of science fiction. Is that right?
Uh,
In the canon of Islamic science fiction of the 20th century?
yes. I mean, I think I sort of almost reluctantly would, just because the it is so much concerned with Islam that it's hard. I think to say it's not Islamic is hard for me to say.
Mm. And then I said I wanted to end with this question because I know that you think a lot about both the filming of the novel and, of course, the novel itself or the book itself. Um, how would you change the film if you were asked? And or maybe how would you change the second film, one that's coming out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way I would change the first film is I think I joked about this somewhere, but is that you have the guy kill Paul at the end, end of story.
and then the film ends, right?
Yeah, there.
Okay.
Part one is just one, but I think the way I would change the sequel um, is I think partly it would be about the depiction of the Fremen, and I think I would definitely want to see the burial ritual for the man that Paul kills, because that's a really important part of the book. And that's actually a part where they reference some really cool, deep, deep cuts Islamic theology stuff in
Mm,
the terms. But
mm,
also, I would like to see more of an exploration of the differences among the Fremen, and to show it's hinted at in the first Dune novel and in the sequel that the Fremen differ about how much they actually follow Paul and whether it's strategic or not, and who actually likes him or not. And I think it would be really cool if the movie increased that further. For example, in the novel, there's some Fremen smugglers who don't like the Fremen following Paul, and they think that the Seats tribe that Stilgar leads doesn't really know what they're doing. And I know in the sequel, they're definitely going to include these smugglers in there. And I think that would be such a cool way to show that, decolonization, not all decolonial people are the same. And I think showing that diversity and bringing that out even further from what's in the novel would be great. And then I think also just fleshing out the Bene Gesserit and the Padishah and these other imperial characters and bringing out some of the Islamic and other and Buddhist influences, even from the imperialist side, would be great. So that you're showing that the Muslimness of Dune isn't just among the Fremen, but is throughout the Dune world.
Haris Durrani, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can follow Haris on Twitter at @HDurnity and buy his novella Technologies of the Self at all good bookshops. His essay Frank Herbert, the Republican Salafist, can be found on newlinesmag.com. This week's podcast was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. You can subscribe to the New Lines Magazine podcast on your favorite podcast app. And of course, you can find more of the best stories from the Middle East and beyond on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all.